Forward. No, it's okay now. No, no. Where is that? Let's get it back. Stable. Okay.
I'm trying to speak too loud. Just bang on the. Okay, every time, everyone. So I might regret this, but I thought that we can talk a little bit about Pidyon Shvuyim. Just to clarify before I start talking what I'm not going to be speaking about. I'm not speaking about any specific deal, whether we should support or should not support. The truth is we don't have most of the information, and none of us are really qualified to make those decisions. But I don't want to get into anything political. I was talking to somebody before Mincha. If I really wanted to get political, we talk about kashrut, but that's another discussion. But I don't get into anything political. Yeah, but we have a topic which is really B'rumo Shel Olam. Yeah, this is the whole country is talking about it. The whole world is talking about it, and we should know at least what the Torah has to say about it, or at least what the relevant sources are, so we can be a little bit better informed. So, just purely from a halachic perspective, what does the Torah say about this mitzvah? Because we've heard a lot of things that have been bandied around over the last 15 months. Obviously, this is an incredibly sensitive topic, incredibly emotional topic. And we've heard this line, which is, you see it on every street corner, just about, Pidyon Shvuyim, Einacha Mitzvah, Pidyon Shvuyim. It's true that the Rambam says that. Many people who probably never quoted the Rambam before in their lives suddenly are quoting the Rambam. But it's true that he says that. Whether that sentence in the Rambam has anything to do with today's situation is questionable. So we'll get into that. But essentially, so let's just try and understand again some of the basics. Very broad topic. We can't cover everything, but just to understand the outline, what the Torah has to say. So we find in the Gemara Bava Batra Daf Chet Amud Bet, it says Pidyon Shvuyim Mitzvah Rabahi. Right, Pidyon Shvuyim is a great mitzvah. This is not, unfortunately, this is not a new thing in Jewish history that we have captives. This is something that has happened, that has always been. And different forms and different ways, but throughout the generations, we've had captives and we've had to redeem them in different ways. Now, the Rambam does write, right? Pidyon Shvuyim, he says, it's actually interesting. He says, Ein lecha mitzvah gdola ke Pidyon Shvuyim. He says there you have no greater mitzvah like Pidyon Shvuyim. And later on, we'll get back to this Rambam, but later on in the same halacha, he writes again. He says, Ein lecha mitzvah rabbah ke Pidyon Shvuyim. So what's the difference between mitzvah gdola and mitzvah rabbah? Okay, is what to talk about there, but it's twice in the same halacha. Very clear, very much he stresses that. At the same time, we know that we have a Mishnah, Masechet Gittin, where the Mishnah tells us, Ein podin tashvin yete al kadei dmehen. Why? And the reason is mipnei tikkun haolam. So almost in the same breath, as soon as we said, we have this great mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, also there is a limitation. The limitation is Ein podin tashvin yete al kadei dmehen, which means there is a certain price, and you cannot go beyond that price. What is that price? How do we measure that price? Who determines that price? Okay, these are all questions, but that is the basic that is the basic foundation. Now, there is another Gemara in Gittin, a bit later on. The Gemara talks about a certain specific case, and it seems to be, the implication of the Gemara seems to be that there are times when we do release hostages, yet al kadei dmehen, where we do pay that exorbitant price. And we find there is a machloket amongst the Rishonim. The case there, which the Gemara brings, it's in the Agados Churban, without getting into it now, but it's very clearly there is a case of sakanat nefashot, meaning a case of clear and immediate sakanat nefashot for the one who was taken hostage. And based on that, Tosfot writes, they say, that which the Mishnah said, that we don't pay an exorbitant price, that is only in a situation where there is no pekuach nefesh. But if there is pekuach nefesh, if lives are at stake and lives are in danger, so then we pay the price. Again, we still haven't determined what price means and what we're talking about when we say that. But Tosfot says that we would go here. The Ramban, on the other hand, says no. The Ramban says no. He says every case of Shvuyim is the case of Pekuach Nefesh, and that's exactly what the Mishnah was talking about when it gave us this limitation. Okay, so that's the basic framework in the Gemara and the Rishonim. There's not more to discuss. Let me read to you the language of the Rambam, because it's very clear what he says, or he stresses how important this is. He says, Pidyon Shvuyim kodem lapanasat aniyim v'lichsutan. Says, Pidyon Shvuyim comes before, takes priority over being able to sustain poor people. There is no greater mitzvah like Pidyon Shvuyim. Why? שהשבוי הרי הוא בכלל הרעבים והצמאים והערומים ועומד בסכנת נפשות. We've heard just some of the stories, and I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure there are some that we will never hear. The most terrible things, anything that we could imagine, and things beyond what we could imagine. That is the situation of Shevi, right? It's hunger and thirst and starvation and constant threat to. המעלים עיניו מפדיונו, הרי זה עובר לא תאמץ את לבבך, ולא תקפוץ ידך, ולא תעמוד על דמעיך, ולא ידנו בפרך לעיניך, ובתי המצוות פתוח תפתח ידך לא. Right? So many different mitzvot, or so many different things in the Torah, which are, if one does not care about the hostages, one doesn't try and one doesn't act in order to try and fulfill this mitzvah, so one is negating that. One of the most famous pieces of halachic literature that relates to this question in contemporary times is a Tshuva of Rav Ovadia Yosef in Yirmiyahu Omer. And again, it's questionable whether what Rav Ovadia wrote about 50 odd years ago is relevant to today's situation, but it's been quoted a lot. So I'll read you just the bottom line of what he says, and this appears in Yirmiyahu Omer and Chelek Yud, in Choshen Mishpat. This relates to the hostage crisis that took place in Entebbe. We all know the story. Ultimately, there were no negotiations there, and the hostages most of them were released. But so he writes like this: the language of the tshuva and the language of the answer, the bottom line. He says as follows: ביום כ"ט סיוון תשל"ו נחטף מטוס של חברת אפרון שהיה בדרכו מפריז לישראל על ידי מחבלים. Okay, this flight was hijacked, as we know. במטוס החטוף היו הרבה נוסעים. תוכם 104 יהודים שהיו בדרכם לישראל. The flight on its way to Israel, there were 104 Jewish passengers on board, amongst the others. המטוס הונחת באוגנדה שמרוחק 4,000 kilometers מישראל. Right, and we know 4,000 kilometers away, the flight was taken to Uganda, and there the terrorists received assistance from the authorities, they received immunity, etc. Okay, and their demands were, ודרשו כי בתוך 48 שעות, that within 48 hours, ישוחררו חבריהם, they wanted, what were the demands for the Jewish passengers? They said, 40 מחבלים הכלואים בישראל. There were 40 terrorists that were jailed in Israeli prisons that they wanted released. Those were demands within 48 hours. And this is the question, אותה שאלה, האם על פי ההלכה יש לשחרר את המחבלים הכלואים בישראל כדרישת החוטפים? Obviously, we all know how it ended over there, but the question that was posed was, what does the halakha say about such a matter? Again, all other things being equal. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to emphasize it again. When you have a question like this in halakha, so we know just as when you have a question of medical halakha, you have to ask the doctors and you have to ask the experts as to what they say. Even something as simple, straightforward as, for example, fasting on Yom Kippur, right? A Rav can't answer that question without speaking to the doctor and knowing what the medical facts are. So in a case like this, where there are so many things, security considerations and military considerations, tactical, obviously one has to have all that information, one has to consult with those people. That's why we're not giving a bottom line, we're not giving any sort of psak halacha here, but just understanding what the halachic considerations are. So again, all other things being equal, he says, האם על פי ההלכה יש לשחרר את המחבלים הכלואים על מנת להציל את חייהם של החטופים היהודים? This is the question. Should you therefore release those terrorists in order to save the lives of the Jewish hostages? או שמא יש לומר שמלבד שעל ידי כך פותחים פתח לחטיפות נוספות כדי לזכות שחרור מחבלים נוספים לאחר שיצליחו במזימתם זו, right? More than anybody knew at the time. But if you are going to give in to the demands, maybe you're opening the way, you're going to cause, you're releasing those terrorists, they're going to go back to terror, they're going to maybe be involved in further kidnappings, etc. So that's the question. So I'll take the conclusion that Rav Ovadia comes to over there. And again, there's a lot of debate. And there's a lot of those who say that he changed his mind, those who say he didn't change his mind, but I haven't seen anything authoritative on the topic. But this is what he said at the time. At the end of the day, he says as follows. He says, באו מן זה נראה שבאמת עלינו לחוש יותר ויותר לסכנה המיידית של מעט היהודים החטופים, כשאלת החרב מתנופפת על ראשם על ידי מחבלים אכזריים, חוטבי המטוס המאיימים להוציאם להורג עד יום ג' תמוז בשעה זה, 2:00 PM. He says, in that situation, you had a direct, a clear and present threat to the lives of those that they said, within 48 hours, we're going to kill them. So that is clear and immediate pikuach nefesh, that is pikuach nefesh bahoveh, that is pikuach nefesh that involves there's no question about that. It's in the present. It's certainly saving lives. What may come afterwards? So he says, הסכנה העתידה והעלולה להתרחש בשחרור הבאים המחבלים הכלואים אינה עומדת כיום על הפרק באופן מיידי. Says what will be in the future, that is something in the future, there's a safek, and therefore his conclusion at that point was the current, present, certain pikuach nefesh, what may be a safek, what may be in the future, and what is uncertain. Okay, so that is one tshuva, which is, as I say, it's been very, very widely quoted and widely discussed. That is what Rav Avadia writes regarding Entebbe. As I said, there are those who say today, later on he changed his mind. He said, I don't know. I don't know if anybody managed to ask him, and that we're not able to. We certainly can't ask him now, and that's not something that we can know. But the question is, would those considerations be the same right now, and is this the way the halacha should look at it? So first of all, a lot of this is based on a shir that I heard from Rav Rimon. Rav Rimon gave essentially 4 or 5 or 6 different reasons why he felt that the logic of Rav Avadia's tshuva is not applicable and not necessarily relevant to today's situation. So the first point, let's just talk about this idea of pikuach nefesh ba'oveh versus pikuach nefesh ba'atid, or maybe pikuach nefesh that's vadai versus pikuach nefesh that's safek. Okay, we have a lot of sources. We have a lot of sources in contemporary poskim that talk about how do we define pikuach nefesh, and everybody agrees that there has to be some limitation. There has to be some line where we draw, where we say this is pikuach nefesh and this is not, because we know the Mishnah, the Gemara in Yoma says that for pikuach nefesh is docher Shabbat, even safek pikuach nefesh is docher Shabbat, right? If it's and Yom Kippur, if there's a doubt, something which might be pikuach nefesh, we can transgress Shabbat or Yom Kippur or whatever. But what do we mean when we say something that might be pikuach nefesh? Does it mean anything that might possibly somehow, somewhere down the road lead to pikuach nefesh? We can't say that, because then you could say anything. You could come up with anything in the world. You could say this might lead to pikuach nefesh. A person is a medical student. They need to drive to university on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur. They have a lecture on Chutz La'aretz. They have a lecture. They have to go. They have to take notes. They have to sit there and write B'tzimor Shel Yom Kippur. Why? Because it's a medical class, and one day they'll be a doctor. And if they didn't have that information, they wouldn't be able to save their life. Okay, you're all laughing. It's ridiculous. But the point, that's exactly what I'm saying. There has to be somewhere where we say this is not a relevant safek that comes into account. So does that mean that we make a distinction between what's happening now and what might happen in the future? So not necessarily. The Chazon Ish, I mean, the Chazon Ish says that essentially what the distinction is, it's not between what I have now versus what might be in the future, but it's how likely is it, how realistic is it? You might say the language he uses, he says, it's not whether the person whose life I'm saving is in front of me now or isn't. That's based on the Nodab Yehuda, which was always the classical, that was the way that he writes it. But he says, in other words, how likely is it that this is something, how certain is it this is going to lead to pikuach nefesh? Meaning, is this, how feasible? So if you look at, you look at the statistics, there he's talking about a completely different case. He's talking about the case of autopsies and etc. But if you look at the statistics, then if you say that however many, again, and how do we know? We're not going to ask the rabbis on this. We're going to ask the security experts who have the information. And if the security experts say the information is you're going to release however many hundreds or however many thousands of terrorists, and they say 82% of them are going to go back to terror. I saw something today that even the first hostage deal that was about a year ago, so of that, there were, I think, 132 terrorists who were released back into Yehuda v'Shomron. Dozens of them have already been involved in terror. 33 of them have been arrested again. Four of them have been eliminated in IDF operations. So it's not a safek that it's going to lead to loss of life. It's a vada. It's closer to certainty that this is. So it's pikuach nefesh here and it's pikuach nefesh there. Again, which one now is going to outweigh, and how do we make those calculations? Very, very complex. But just to brush it off and to say, oh, well, this is right now and that's going to be in the future, it's not so simple and it's not so clear that that distinction works. As I say, one has to look deeper and one has to see what are the, what are the chances here? What are the possibilities on this side? What are the possibilities on that side? Which is a greater sense of pikuach nefesh, and which would necessarily outweigh? Okay, that is one consideration. There are others, but I don't think we have any more time left today, so we can discuss it tomorrow. Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha, Omer, Tzakash Baruch Hu, Tzakash Israel, Facha Ba'aleim Torah Mitzvot, Shnei Madra Chavetz Ma'atzim.